So last week in our Sacred Gathering, we continued our series of Mark. We hit the center point. I think in a lot of ways, the hinge that the whole gospel is based around, the kind of the main point, and that is Peter's recognition of who Jesus was as the Messiah, as the sent one, as well as the call to discipleship. Okay, Jesus says, yes, you understand who I am. Now let me define that for you. It's going to start with my own pain, my own suffering, my own injustice, and me using that to be what brings about the healing of the world. And so this next story kind of gives us the other piece, the other half that is very important about that. And so we're going to see right at the beginning of this story, which is often called the transfiguration or the transformation of Jesus, we see the words 6 days later. And so this was less than a week after this key moment in which Peter and the disciples recognize who Jesus is, and Jesus begins defining for them what it means for him to be the Messiah, the sent one, and what it means to follow him. So this story is connected very strongly with that, and it's an important one because right as soon as Peter recognizes who Jesus is going to start redefining it, because most of us want, the king who can kick butt for us. We want someone who is going to, enlighten us. We want someone who is going to promote us and be about our ways. That's what the Messiah is supposed to be, right? Make everything right again just the way I wanted it. Jesus is going to say, no, that is not in fact what I'm about. I'm about suffering for others. I'm about being misunderstood and injustice falling upon me, that we can bring about the healing of the world. But it's an important part of this gospel story, and what Jesus came to do is not just that Jesus came to suffer. He's not just a martyr. He's not just providing an inspiring example of how deep love goes and his willingness to suffer for the sake of others. There is also an important piece that God goes through death, goes through sin, goes through this pain and suffering for the sake of bringing about the healing of the world and the restoration of all things, and Jesus will in fact return to the glory. God is not about doom and gloom for its own sake. It's a very open realization that the world is dark and hard, and that Jesus is willing to pay whatever price about the healing. So the teaching about the crucifixion is balanced by his glorification. We want to tend to skip the crucifixion, which is, I suspect, why Mark has us focus on it so much. But the glorification, the fact things will be made right in the end, is an important part of this story as well. So I'm going to read from Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 8. So 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and brought them to the top of a very high mountain where they were alone, and he was transformed in front of them. His clothes were amazingly bright, brighter than if they'd been bleached white. Elijah and Moses appeared and were talking with Jesus. Peter reacted to all of this by saying to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He said this because he didn't know how to respond, for the 3 of them were terrified. And then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice spoke from the cloud, "This is my son, whom I dearly love. Listen to him." Suddenly, looking around, they saw no one with them except Jesus. So some kind of just random notes on this story, this very short but I think very important story. So one, as they're going out up onto this mountain, Mark yet again points out that the location of this amazing event is in the wilderness. Mark seems particularly attuned to the fact that many of Jesus' most amazing miracles, most of the ways that God is working at this time, are not at the center. It's not the places where people would go to expect such things. It's not at the temple. It's not with the best educated or the richest or the most impressive, however we want to do that, right? The most powerful. It is at the fringes. It is in the wilderness. It is working with the poor and the peasants, people who often don't get it. This seems to be a huge theme of the Bible overall. God showing up in unexpected places, working on the fringes. And Mark points us out yet again, this amazing experience is not happening in any of the expected places. It is yet again out in the wilderness, out in the fringes. It's interesting that the way he describes this, and we're come back to this a couple of times, is one in which the veil of reality is kind of pulled back in some ways. We can mistake the real world for being ordinary, being nothing special, especially nowadays when we've been trained to think of the world as a simply material thing. And lurking behind that, the assumption in many people's worldview is it's some kind of a cosmic accident, right? And I love this term that I've run into over the years. It's a kind of a term from the Celtic spirituality, Irish and Scottish spirituality is from the Middle Ages, what they call thin places. And the way I once had it described to me was, imagine like crepe paper, like you're doing a birthday party, right? And as you twist it, you kind of get this thick section, and then it gets thin, and a thick section, and it gets thin. And they're just kind of understanding of the world where there were places, or there are times, or there are moments when the veil that the world is not a deeply spiritual place gets a little thin. You can kind of see through it. The crepe paper is there, it's a thinner place. And this seems to be one of those moments, right? It's a mountain that they may have been on before, but it's a place in the wilderness. It's a timing that God needs to teach them something special. And so the real world in its normalcy is revealed as being a deeply spiritual, a deeply profound place, a place that God is haunting, that God is so close. And so we see this experience of them, that they have this thin place, that they are all experiences together. And I think this is something that is often available to us when we're willing to pay attention, even if it isn't going to look exactly like this and for these exact reasons. So a lot of ink has been spilled on this meeting between Moses and Elijah and Jesus. So one thing people are really quick to point out is, if you wanted, a good human symbols of the kind of two major sections in the Old Testament, especially in the minds of Jesus and the other Jews that are with him, we've got the law, the Pentateuch, and we've got the prophets, everybody else. And so if you want a good representative of the law, of course you're going to go with Moses, right? The man who knew God and who was the one who God revealed this law, this structure, this identity that his people were expected to have. You want a good, representative of the prophets, you're not going to do much better than Elijah. He's a wild man. He represents the prophets as, again, from the fringe. They are not part of the establishment, although there were court prophets, but I think the prophets, as most of us tend to think of them, are those willing to speak to power from the outside, willing to say God's voice against the culture. And Elijah fits this to the T. He had a powerful ministry. God did some incredible miracles through his life, and yet he was an outsider his entire life. Even his protege Elisha fit in better with culture than he did, and yet God spoke powerfully through him. Both are associated with unusual deaths. Elijah got scooped up to heaven by these angelic chariots of fire. It's a very wild, dramatic moment that he does not die a normal death. And at Jesus' time, there was a lot of legends around Moses' death as well, because it's never really narrated in the Bible. We don't exactly know how he died. He went up onto this mountain. He got to see the promised land, and God took him. So there were a lot of legends at the time that he also died in some special way. He was scooped up and didn't die like a normal person. Don't really know, but that probably would have been in a lot of Jesus' contemporary minds, including the disciples, when this happened. Both men had, I would say, deeply confrontational and deeply lonely ministries. As I said, Elijah was an outsider. Moses was too, in a lot of ways. He led this group of people who did not appreciate what he was doing. It felt like he was almost always fighting with his people. No, just trust God, right? Elijah says the same thing. No, just trust God. They both spent an amazing amount of time in the wilderness. Moses, for most of his ministry, right? 40 years having these people fed by manna out in the wilderness. And Elijah's the same thing. He lives there during droughts. He keeps returning to it again and again when he needs encouragement or new messages. Again, in the fringes, out in the thin places, which I think in some ways, part of this conversation for Jesus may have simply been encouragement, right? Here are two men who understand what it's like to be misunderstood and represent God above all else, and how deeply lonely that could be when they feel like they're against everyone and everything. Here are two people who also discovered it was worth it, I think, in the end, right? They knew things about God. They experienced God in ways that most of us are kind of jealous of. There's a reason that they're considered these spiritual giants. And I can't help but wonder, as Jesus is heading toward the cross, if here are two figures who are going to get probably better than most people in human history can, what it is Jesus is going to. They don't get the full extent. There's no one capable of walking the road Jesus is going to walk on his own. But here are two people who probably come closer than most. The other piece is both of these men were famous for these theophanies, a good technical word meaning people who met with God on mountains, right? Moses does several times. He goes up onto this mountain to receive the law, to receive the Ten Commandments, to have this ongoing conversation with God. Elijah's one of the most famous incidents of his life is going up on the exact same mountain and meeting God when he's at his most discouraged, right? There's this great story of him going out, and then we've got fire, and we've got the wind, and we've got earthquakes, and yet God speaks to him in this still small voice. And so both men had very unique and special theophanies by meeting God on mountains. And there's some fun irony in this story, because yet again, these two men who met God on a mountain are meeting God, and yet God is in a very different form, right? This story is set up in many ways like a classic theophany. Almost every time God's presence is supposed to be seen and felt, we get all these things. We get the incredible light that we see in their clothes. We get the thunder of the voice. We get the clouds that are there that shows up when God fills the temple, when God is giving the law. And yet these two men in this theophany are meeting with a poor carpenter, a person who's misunderstood. He's not a king. He doesn't appear to be God in the traditional sense. And yet they are meeting with God in a very different, a very important and revealed form. So there's some kind of fun irony in that. But we also hear God's voice, right? Affirming who Jesus is and that he's part of this power and this cloud and this glory. So it's just kind of a neat tying together of a lot of these kind of ongoing traditions. And so that's, I think, the thing we want to keep asking as we look at these stories is, okay, so the Gospel of Mark is largely based around this idea is, okay, who is Jesus? And what does it look like to actually follow him? So what can this story of Jesus' transformation teach us about Jesus himself? One, and I think this is Elijah and Moses, functioning in their most symbolic, is there have been all these strains in the Old Testament. There's been all this anticipation, things like, Moses' final prophecy saying, there's going to be a prophet like me someday who's going to be a leader and a lawgiver and who will provide in the wilderness, right? We get this in many, many of the different prophets, hints of this guy is going to be born of a virgin. This guy is going to be about restoration and healing and restoring sight to the blind and freeing prisoners, right? We are going to get a kingly strain. David recognizing that there's going to be a true king, one that is totally different. And so we get all these strands of priest and prophet and king in this new creation when everything is made right. And I think this moment when glory is tied to suffering and misunderstanding of these famous figures showing up and being in awe of what it is that God is up to this time, all these strands are kind of brought together in this moment. This is what we've been waiting for. This is what everything's been leading up. This is what the hints and the foreshadowing and everything has been preparing us for. This man, this God, is finally here. And so I think it's a important moment to bring all those focal points together. this appearance is really important in the way Mark chooses to tell his story, because Mark's end of the gospel, which we'll get to, almost trails off. It leaves us on a cliffhanger. It leaves us with no actual resurrection appearances. The women at the tomb are told about Jesus' resurrection, but unlike the other gospels, we never actually get to see that narrated. And so this is, I think, a really important hint that, again, this isn't just some martyr. This isn't just some inspirational figure who believed so much in what they were doing that they were willing to die for it. This is a hint of who Jesus actually is and where this entire story is heading. Again, we first hear about the cross just a couple verses before, and then we hear about glorification, that beyond all of this, there is hope. There is a fullness. There is a restoration of all things. And so this is the only real appearance we get to see of Jesus in his glory in this gospel. And so I think it's a very important point to put those two pieces together, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the glorification. You can't separate them out, as many people have tried to do. Sometimes just skipping to the glorification, sometimes idealizing the self-sacrifice, right? Those pieces are together in Jesus' life and Jesus' story. The pain and suffering are real, as is God's life and power breaking through in the resurrection, as is God's eternal strength and glory and power being used towards, selflessness, etc. So you can't break those pieces apart. And the theophany aspect is one that is just really important, I think, for understanding the Bible overall. This is an important reminder of who this is that Moses and Elijah are talking with. They are talking with the Son, but they are talking with God. And so a couple other verses I pulled that are just kind of an important reminder of how this is. So in John 1, we hear, "No one has ever seen God. God, the only Son, who's at the Father's side, has made God known. And the Son is the invisible image. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the one who is first over all creation." That's from Colossians 1. And so I think one of the most key things we have to understand is, if we want to know what God is like, we don't want to go to abstract ideas like philosophy, that God is all powerful, that God is, all knowing. Those things are descriptive terms that we have theologically applied. But at the end of the day, if you want to know what God is like, don't think of a big, shiny, powerful being, although I think that is true. If you want to know what God is like, you look at Jesus. God is, in fact, humble. He is, in fact, compassionate. He is, in fact, self-sacrificial. He is, in fact, somewhat baffling at times. He is Jesus, right? And the Bible tells us again and again, if you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus' life, the things he values, the way he spends his time and his energy, the things he teaches, right? That's the hint that God the Father is giving us in this story when we've got the loud thundering voice. Listen to him. Because we don't tend to. We tend to try to make God into something else. And I know a lot of people who really struggle with the Old Testament times. There are times when God is deeply angry, and there are times when Jesus is deeply angry. But I don't think that it's helpful for us to have this view that there was this angry, petty God in the Old Testament, and that Jesus is loving and kind, and that there was a shift in God in some way, shape, or form. When we look at Jesus and say, who is this? This is what God is actually like. When we go back and read the Old Testament, we are going to find that voice there. We are going to find that character there. And passages that appear odd, we're going to note, all of a sudden don't seem as important as they used to. Passages that seem odd, there's a lot less of them. We're going to find a ton more actually affirming when we use that lens of, what is God like? God is like Jesus. And I think it's the same thing for people that want to prefer a tough guy God from Revelation and places like that. God is powerful, but we need to look at God as self-sacrificial, God as kind and creative, and the things that Jesus shows us, again, sometimes baffling, sometimes angry, particularly at people who are going to try to wall God off, or who are going to unjustly do things in the world, break those things God has placed in the world for our benefit and our love, right? And so this theophany, this question, we just need to continually remind ourselves, what is God like? Look at Jesus. Jesus is going to tell us what God is like. And I think the final piece of this we want to ask ourselves is, okay, so what does this teach us and show us for the disciples? And the first piece is simply encouragement. Right? They are really baffled by the fact they've figured out who God, who Jesus is. He's the Messiah, the sent one. They're starting to get a sense that he's a God. And Jesus immediately begins teaching that he is going to lose, that the powers that be that they just cannot stand, that are deeply unfair in the world, are going to win. Is Jesus crazy? Are we following the wrong guy? And then there's this moment that, no, Jesus is not crazy as he's teaching these things. This actually is the plan. I'm going to use these things. Don't mistake these things for the end of the story, because in the end, Jesus will be glorified and returned to the fullness that he so desires, right? So I think the first piece is encouragement. The second piece that's so important for discipleship is this experience is just overwhelming, right? We've got Peter babbling because he doesn't know what else to do or say. The raw presence of God, of Jesus revealed, unrevealed in who he is it's mysterious, it's weird, it's too much. They don't really know what to do with it. And Jesus kind of gives them the hint saying, hey, don't talk about this until after I've been resurrected, which they don't really understand how literal that's going to be yet, right? It's probably a symbol for something. But I think this is a really important thing for us to recognize in the life of discipleship. Raw experiences of God, or just the way God works at a lot of the time, we don't tend to understand in the moment what God is up to. We don't have the context, we don't have the character, we don't have the experience, we don't have the right people around us. And most of our lives are going to have some of these kind of key experiences like this one, when God was so obvious and so real and so huge. And yet it's going to take us years of reflection and continuing to pray over this, continuing to understand the real significance of what is going on. And so I guess I'm a little cynical of the way we approach spirituality a lot in our culture, that, I need to understand all the right things, and then I can decide to sign in or not. I mean, the intellect is an incredibly important part of the spiritual life, but I think many of us are going to experience God and then continue to reflect on the meaning of that. It's going to continue to change us. Most of us are not capable of understanding what it is God is up to in our lives, in the world around us, the things that we're actually part of, until much, much later on. And I think there's a gift in that, even if it is a frustrating one at times. So I think we see that in the life of the disciples, and we see it in our own lives as well. So that's the transfiguration, that's the transformation, whatever you want to call it.